The Boeing 777 was falling from the sky. Both pilots unconscious. 300 passengers screaming. A woman in seat 24C stood up calmly, walked to the cockpit. She wore simple jeans and a faded t-shirt. Nobody knew she was a retired combat pilot. Nobody knew her call sign was Legend. She grabbed the controls, steadied the dying aircraft. "Mayday, mayday, this is Viper requesting assistance." The radio went silent. Then a voice cracked through, shocked, trembling. "Viper? The Viper? Ma'am, we thought you were dead." 3 F-22 Raptors broke from their classified mission. Because some call signs you answer. Always. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. The March afternoon was unusually warm at London Heathrow Airport on Thursday, March 21, 2019, when passengers boarded British Airways Flight 284 to New York. The massive Boeing 777 was nearly full with 300 passengers, a mix of business travelers, tourists, and families heading across the Atlantic. Among them was a woman in her early 40s with short dark hair, sharp green eyes, and a quiet demeanor that made her blend into the crowd. Captain Sarah Viper Chin settled into seat 24C in economy class, her small carry-on tucked under the seat in front of her. She wore faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and running shoes. Nothing about her appearance suggested she had once been one of the most feared combat pilots in the sky, a woman whose call sign made enemy pilots turn and run, a legend whispered about in fighter squadrons around the world. The man in the aisle seat glanced at her and smiled politely. "Heading home." "Something like that," Sarah replied, her voice neutral. She didn't elaborate. She had learned over the past 3 years that the less she said about herself, the better. People asked too many questions when they found out who she used to be. The truth was Sarah Chen was returning to the United States for the first time since she had disappeared 3 years ago. She had been a Navy fighter pilot, one of only a handful of women to fly F-18 Super Hornets in combat. Over 15 years of service, she had flown over 200 combat missions, earned 3 distinguished flying crosses, and accumulated 7 confirmed aerial victories. Her call sign Viper had been earned during her first combat deployment when she shot down 3 enemy fighters in a single engagement with such precision and lethality that her squadron commander said she struck like a viper. But 3 years ago everything changed. During a classified mission over hostile territory, Sarah's aircraft had been severely damaged by ground fire. She managed to complete the mission and bring her crippled F-18 back to the carrier, saving her aircraft and mission-critical intelligence. The Navy wanted to give her a medal. The media wanted to make her a hero. The Secretary of Defense wanted to use her story for recruitment. Sarah wanted none of it. The mission had cost her something more valuable than any medal. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, had taken fatal hits while protecting her damaged aircraft. He had deliberately put himself between her and enemy fire, sacrificing himself so she could complete the mission. He died before he could eject. He left behind a wife and 2 young daughters. The guilt was crushing. The media attention was suffocating. The hero worship felt like a betrayal of Marcus's memory. So Sarah had done the only thing that made sense to her. She resigned her commission, turned down the medal, and disappeared. She moved to a small village in Scotland, took a job as a flying instructor at a civilian flight school, and cut all ties with her military past. For 3 years she had lived quietly, teaching wealthy executives and tourists how to fly small propeller planes. She never flew anything military. She never talked about combat. She never used her call sign. She had buried Viper and tried to become just Sarah, an ordinary flight instructor with an ordinary life. But now she was going back. Marcus's younger daughter was graduating high school, and his widow had found Sarah through a private investigator. The letter had been simple. "Marcus would have wanted you there. Please come." Sarah couldn't refuse. She owed Marcus everything. Flight 284 pushed back from the gate exactly on time. Sarah watched through her window as the ground crew completed their work, their movements efficient and practiced. Even after 3 years away from military aviation, she still observed everything with a pilot's eye, noting procedures, checking safety protocols, assessing the crew's professionalism. The captain's voice came over the intercom, British accent crisp and professional. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison from the flight deck. We're next for takeoff. Flight time to New York will be approximately 7 hours. We'll be cruising at 41,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Sarah tried to relax as the Boeing 777 took off, climbing smoothly into the English sky. London fell away below, the Thames winding through the city like a silver ribbon. She had a book in her bag, but she couldn't concentrate on reading. Her mind was already in New York, already imagining seeing Marcus's family again, already wondering if she could face them without breaking down. The first 3 hours of the flight passed uneventfully. Sarah dozed occasionally, refused the meal service, and mostly stared out the window at the Atlantic Ocean passing beneath them. They were somewhere south of Greenland, halfway across the ocean, when she noticed something wrong. It was subtle at first. A slight vibration through the airframe that didn't feel right. Then a barely perceptible change in the engine sound. Sarah's trained senses, dulled by 3 years of flying nothing but small civilian aircraft, suddenly sharpened. Something was wrong. She looked around the cabin. Nobody else seemed to notice anything. The flight attendants were collecting meal trays, passengers were watching movies or sleeping. Everything appeared normal. But Sarah's instincts were screaming. Then the aircraft shuddered violently. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a harsh chime. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, and this time Sarah heard the tension underneath the comm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately. But Sarah knew this wasn't turbulence. The vibration was wrong. The frequency was wrong. This was a mechanical problem, and it was serious. 30 seconds later, the world exploded. A massive boom echoed through the cabin. The aircraft rolled violently to the right. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Passengers screamed. Through her window, Sarah saw flames streaming from the number 2 engine on the right wing. The engine had catastrophically failed, and the turbine blades had torn through the cowling, damaging the wing structure. The aircraft rolled further right, now at a 40-degree angle. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. She grabbed her oxygen mask and put it on, then helped the panicking businessman next to her get his secured. "Breathe normally," she told him firmly. "Stay calm." But inside, Sarah was calculating. Catastrophic engine failure. Possible wing damage. Aircraft out of control. They were at 41,000 feet over the North Atlantic, hundreds of miles from the nearest airfield. And from the increasingly steep angle of the aircraft, the pilots were losing the fight. The intercom crackled. Captain Morrison's voice, strained and urgent. "This is the captain. We have a serious emergency. Crew, prepare for emergency landing. Passengers, assume brace positions." But the aircraft kept rolling. 50 degrees. 60 degrees. They were going inverted. Sarah looked toward the front of the cabin and her blood ran cold. Through the open cockpit door, protocol required it to stay open during emergencies, she could see both pilots struggling with the controls. Captain Morrison was pulling on the yoke with both hands, his face red with effort. The first officer was frantically working controls, but the aircraft wasn't responding. Then Sarah saw the critical detail that changed everything. Hydraulic fluid was spraying inside the cockpit. The engine failure had severed hydraulic lines. The pilots were losing flight control authority with every passing second. The aircraft rolled past 70 degrees. Passengers were screaming, some praying, some crying. The businessman next to Sarah was frozen in terror. The flight attendants were strapped into jump seats, their faces pale with fear. Sarah made her decision in a fraction of a second. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, fighting against the steep angle of the aircraft. She grabbed seatbacks and pulled herself forward toward the cockpit. A flight attendant saw her and shouted, "Ma'am, sit down." Sarah ignored her and pushed into the cockpit. Captain Morrison looked up, shock and anger on his face. "Get out. Get back to your seat." "I'm a pilot," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "Former Navy. I can help." "We don't need dash," Morrison started, but the aircraft rolled past 80 degrees and his words cut off as he fought the controls. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She assessed the situation in 2 seconds. Hydraulic system A completely failed. System B failing rapidly. System C holding but degrading. The pilots were trying to fly with conventional inputs, but they didn't have enough hydraulic pressure. They needed to switch to alternate control modes. "You're fighting dead controls," Sarah said, moving to stand between the 2 pilot seats. "Switch to alternate law. Manual trim. You need to fly this electrically." Morrison stared at her. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's flown aircraft with worse damage than this. Trust me or we all die. Your choice. Make it fast." The first officer looked at Morrison. "Captain, we're out of options. We're at 90 degrees. We're going to flip." Morrison made his decision. "Do it. Help us." Sarah's hands moved across the panel with practiced speed, switching control modes, rerouting systems, finding any way to get authority back. Reduce power on the good engines. You're creating asymmetric thrust. Ease off. Morrison reduced power. The rolling slowed slightly. Now, Sarah said, we're going to use differential thrust and manual trim to level the wings. First officer, when I say, give me maximum power on engine 1. Captain, neutral on the yoke. Let the trim do the work. This is insane, Morrison muttered, but he followed her instructions. Now, Sarah called. The first officer pushed the throttle forward on engine 1. Sarah adjusted the trim wheels with lightning speed. The aircraft began to respond, the roll slowing, stopping, then gradually reversing. Over the next 3 minutes, Sarah coached the pilots through a series of precise control inputs using thrust differential and trim that conventional airline training didn't cover. These were fighter pilot techniques, ways to fly when your controls are shot to hell and you're trying to bring a damaged aircraft home. Slowly, impossibly, the Boeing 777 rolled back to level flight. They were at 38,000 feet, having lost 3,000 feet in the emergency, but they were flying straight and level. The passengers' screams had faded to shocked silence. Sarah keyed the radio. Mayday, mayday, mayday. British Airways 284, catastrophic engine failure, multiple hydraulic failures, we have control but degraded. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airfield. The response came from Gander Control in Newfoundland. British Airways 284, Gander. Roger your mayday. Nearest suitable is Keflavik, Iceland, 200 miles northeast. Can you make it? Sarah looked at the fuel gauges, did the calculations in her head. Affirmative, Gander. We can make Keflavik. Request emergency equipment standing by. Roger, 284. Be advised we're scrambling fighter escort from Keflavik Air Base. They'll be with you in 5 minutes. Sarah's jaw tightened. Fighter escort. That meant F-15s or F-22s from the NATO Air Base. That meant military pilots who might recognize a voice from the past. Copy, Gander. Standing by for escort. Captain Morrison was staring at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. Who are you? How do you know how to do this? Just a passenger who knows how to fly, Sarah said. But she knew that answer wouldn't satisfy them for long. 4 minutes later, 2 F-22 Raptors appeared on their wings, sleek gray shapes that slid into perfect formation beside the crippled airliner. A voice came over the radio, young, professional. British Airways 284, this is Falcon 1. We have you visual. We'll escort you to Keflavik. Sarah keyed the radio. Falcon 1, copy. Appreciate the escort. We have degraded controls, we'll need talk down on approach. Roger, 284. We'll stay with you all the way. Who am I speaking to? You don't sound like Captain Morrison. Sarah hesitated. She had hoped to avoid this. But these pilots needed to know they could trust the person flying this aircraft. Falcon 1, this is. She took a breath. This is Viper. The radio went completely silent. Not just a pause, but dead air for a full 5 seconds. Then the voice came back and it was filled with shock. Say again your call sign. Did you say Viper? Affirmative. Call sign Viper. Another voice broke in, older, the flight leader. Viper as in Captain Sarah Chin? Navy? That's a firm. Ma'am, this is Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. I flew F-18s with the Marines. We studied your combat missions at Fighter Weapons School. You're supposed to be, everyone thought you were? Dead? Sarah finished. I'm not. I'm just trying to keep 300 people alive. Can we focus on that? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely, ma'am. Hayes's voice was filled with something between reverence and disbelief. Viper, you have the aircraft? I'm assisting the flight crew. They're good pilots, but this bird is badly hurt. I need you to talk us down. Keflavik approach, winds, runway status. Copy that. Keflavik is 40 miles, 12 o'clock. Winds are 320 at 25 gusting to 35. You'll want runway 28. It's 9,000 feet, plenty of room. Weather is marginal visibility 3 miles in snow. Sarah looked at the degraded hydraulics, the damaged wing, the failed engine. This was going to be ugly. Falcon 1, I need you to understand something. We're going to make one approach. I can't go around. If we miss the runway, we're going into the ocean. So your vectors need to be perfect. Understood, ma'am. We'll get you there. Over the next 25 minutes, Sarah worked with Captain Morrison and the first officer to nurse the crippled Boeing 777 toward Iceland. Every control input was a negotiation with failing systems. Every course correction required precise thrust management. The 2 F-22s stayed glued to their wings, their pilots calling out altitudes, headings, speeds. Viper 20 miles out. Descend to 4,000. Reduce speed to 190. Sarah coached Morrison through the descent. Easy on the controls. Small inputs. Let the aircraft settle. 10 miles. Descend to 2000. Speed 160. You're on glide path. The runway lights appeared through the snow, bright and welcoming. Sarah had Morrison deploy the landing gear. The nose gear came down with a reassuring thunk, but the main gear indicators showed only 2 green lights. The damaged hydraulics meant they couldn't confirm the right main gear was locked. Falcon 1, we have gear indication issues. Right main may not be locked. Copy Viper. Emergency equipment is ready for anything. You've got this. 5 miles out. Sarah had Morrison configure for landing flaps, slats, final trim adjustments. Every change to the configuration affected how the damaged aircraft handled. She compensated with thrust and rudder, keeping them aligned with the runway. 2 miles Viper. On glide path. Looking good. Through the windscreen the runway filled their view. Sarah's hands hovered near the controls, ready to take over if Morrison struggled. Captain, when you touch down the right gear might collapse. Be ready to use left rudder and left brake to keep us straight. Morrison nodded, his face pale but determined. Understood. 1 mile. 500 feet. 300. The F-22s pulled up in a way giving them room. Morrison's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke. Sarah's voice was calm, steady. You've got it, Captain. Just like we practiced. Ease it down. The main wheels touched with a solid thump. The right gear held, it was locked after all, just a bad indicator. Morrison deployed the thrust reversers on the good engines, used differential braking to compensate for the dead engine. The Boeing 777 rolled down runway 28, slowing gradually. At 30 knots, Morrison brought the aircraft to a stop. He set the parking brake and shut down the engines. For a moment, nobody spoke. They had made it. All 300 people alive. Then Morrison turned to Sarah and she saw tears in his eyes. You saved us. You saved everyone. I don't know how to thank you. Sarah shook her head. You and your first officer did the flying. I just helped. No, the first officer said quietly. Without you we'd be in the ocean. Who are you really? Before Sarah could answer, the cockpit door burst open. Emergency crews were boarding, evacuating passengers, checking the pilots. Sarah slipped out of the cockpit and tried to blend into the crowd of evacuating passengers. But it was too late. The F-22 pilots had landed and were waiting at the bottom of the aircraft stairs. When Sarah emerged, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes snapped to attention and saluted. The other pilots followed suit. Captain Chin, Hayes said formally. It's an honor, ma'am. Sarah returned the salute out of habit, then dropped her hand. I'm not a captain anymore. I'm just Sarah. Ma'am, with all respect, you'll always be Viper. What you just did up there, keeping that aircraft flying with failed hydraulics, talking the crew through an impossible approach, that was legendary. A crowd was gathering. Passengers who had just evacuated, emergency personnel, airport officials. Someone had a phone out, recording. Sarah felt the familiar walls closing in, the attention she had fled 3 years ago coming back. I need to go, she said quietly. But Hayes stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Ma'am, before you disappear again, and I'm guessing you will, I need you to know something. What happened to Lieutenant Rivera wasn't your fault. We all read the classified report. He made a choice. A pilot's choice. To save his wingman and complete the mission. He'd make the same choice again. Sarah's throat tightened. You don't understand, Dash. I do understand. I've lost wingmen too. The guilt never goes away. But hiding from it doesn't honor their sacrifice. Flying does. Saving lives does. What you just did up there, that honored Lieutenant Rivera more than any medal ever could. Sarah couldn't speak. Hayes saluted again, then stepped aside to let her pass. She walked through the airport in a daze, past the growing crowd, past the news cameras that were starting to arrive. She just wanted to get to a quiet place and process what had happened. But as she rounded a corner toward the exit, she nearly collided with someone. It was a woman in her mid-40s with 2 teenage girls beside her. Sarah's heart stopped. She recognized them instantly from photos Marcus had showed her years ago. His wife, Christina. His daughters, Sophia and Elena. Christina's eyes widened in recognition. Sarah? Is that you? I was coming to New York. For Elena's graduation. I was going to call you when I landed but Dash. We saw the news, Christina interrupted. Her eyes were filling with tears. They're saying you saved 300 people. They're saying you're a hero. I'm not Dash, Sarah started, but Christina cut her off with a fierce hug. Marcus always said you were the best pilot he ever flew with, Christina whispered in her ear. He said if anyone ever needed saving in the air, he'd want Viper on the stick. He was right. Sarah broke down then, 3 years of grief and guilt pouring out. Christina held her, and Sophia and Elena joined the embrace. They stood there in the middle of the airport, this family bound by loss and love and sacrifice. When Sarah finally pulled back, Elena, 17 now, so grown up from the last photo Sarah had seen, was looking at her with eyes exactly like her father's. Dad used to tell us stories about you. About Viper. He said you were the bravest person he knew. Now I know he was right. Your father was brave, Sarah said, her voice breaking. He saved my life. I'm only here because of him. Then live, Sophia said quietly. She was 15, serious and thoughtful. Don't hide. Dad wouldn't want that. He'd want you flying, saving people, being the pilot he always knew you were. Sarah looked at these girls, at Marcus's daughters who had grown up without their father, and she saw understanding in their eyes, not blame. She saw forgiveness she had never thought to ask for. Okay, she whispered. Okay. 6 months later, Sarah Chin stood on the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, back in a Navy flight suit, back in the cockpit of an F-18 Super Hornet. She had returned to active duty at the personal request of the Chief of Naval Operations. The Navy had wanted her back. More importantly, she wanted to be back. Her aircraft sat on the catapult, ready for launch. On the nose was painted her call sign, Viper. But underneath it was something new, added at her request, for Marcus. She ran through her pre-flight checks, muscle memory from thousands of hours returning like she had never left. The catapult officer gave the signal. Sarah saluted, pushed the throttles to full power, and felt the aircraft slam forward as the catapult launched her into the sky. She climbed through 10,000 feet, 20,000, 30,000. At 40,000 feet, she leveled off and looked around at the vast blue sky. This was where she belonged. Not hiding in Scotland. Not running from her past. Here, in the sky, where Marcus had taught her that sacrifice and service and saving lives mattered more than guilt or fear. She keyed her radio. Tower Viper. Requesting permission for some acrobatics. Viper, you're cleared. Show us what you've got, ma'am. Sarah smiled and rolled the F-18 inverted, then pulled through into a perfect loop. She flew with the joy and freedom she had lost 3 years ago, feeling alive again, feeling like herself again. She thought about the 300 people on Flight 284 who went home to their families because she had been there. She thought about Marcus, who had given his life so she could have hers. She thought about his daughters, who had given her permission to live again. At 41,000 feet over the Atlantic, a woman had saved everyone on board. And when her call sign was spoken, F-22s had broken radio silence because legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to return.